Lilies and Gillies, Maidenslave here. Today I'm going to be talking about some Death Magnets by Metallica. The production is not that great. The only good thing about it is it's, for the most part, better than St. Anger's production, especially with the incorporation of Lars' snare drum, which is actually turned on. Other than that, it actually doesn't sound quite good, especially when you compare it to most of Metallica's albums. The guitar sound is, I don't know, it just feels a little bit neutered to me. It sounds fuzzy, but like not in the good way. It doesn't sound as blistering and loud and big and powerful as it did on pretty much every album that they did before St. Anger, including Load and Reload, by the way. James's evolution with actually singing definitely progressed on this album. The most notable thing being the fact that Rick Rubin, who produced the album, had him actually go back and sing in the register of E, which is the standard tuning of a guitar, of which they pretty much played on their first 4 albums for the most part. Rick decided that it was better for James to go back up to E because he sounded a little bit more anxious. That was one of the great things about James' performance on a lot of the older albums, and that actually goes for a lot of other singers in the genre, including Dave Mustaine, who's recently gone down to D, and he kind of lost some of his aggression and some of his anxiety in his singing as well. So it was great to hear James go back up to E. He could definitely pull it off, and he sounded really, really good on this album. There's definitely been some criticism on this album as far as Metallica pretty much rehashing what they did in the 80s and maybe even a little bit with the Black Album. And even when this album came out and I started hearing of these criticisms right away, I wasn't even a big fan of Metallica at the time, but I just, you know, Metallica can't really seem to win. They're kind of in a catch-22 situation, because if they decide to do something new and different, or maybe even the stuff that they were doing with Load and Reload, people will say, you know, why don't you just go back to how you were in the 80s and just play thrash and be awesome like you used to be? Well, in my opinion, they did that to the best of their abilities with Death Magnetic, and of course a bunch of people said that they were just rehashing what they did in the past and they ought to do something new. So for me, it's like you can't really win if you're Metallica at this point. And yeah, of course, there are some definite moments on this album in which they obviously go back to the structure that they had in the 80s, and for the most part, I don't really mind it. But there are some occasions on the album in which it's so noticeable that it actually hinders the music. That Was Just Your Life opens up the album, which is a good enough opening. It has a little ominous kind of clean guitar feature there in the beginning. It sounds a little bit dark, and of course it kind of builds and builds, and then it goes into the main riff, which sounds exactly like the main riff from Jump in the Fire. The solos are fine, the singing's fine, the drumming's fine. It's all pretty damn good, but probably one of the weaker songs for me on this album. The End of the Line was actually, I believe, the first piece of music that we got to hear from Metallica with this album. Or at least for me, I remember on YouTube, I saw a video of them playing the first part of what is now The End of the Line, and I remember not liking it because it pretty much opened up the same, but where it would go into a really good groove on the album, it kind of went to a generic riff, and then I didn't really like it. But once I got it on the album, I was expecting to hear that and expecting not to like it, but you know, it goes into, like I said, a really good groove slash jam. Of course, it eventually speeds up. Definitely one of the stronger moments on the album to me. I really like the whole midsection when it slows down and you have the bass kind of doing its own little line with the vocals. I like the little chorus slash verse section that James is singing. He has a really, really good delivery. The solos are fine. The opening of Broken, Beaten, Scarred definitely kind of reminds me of some moments on Injustice for All, which was pretty cool to hear, but for the most part I actually did like this song a bit more than even some songs on Injustice for All, because once it gets going, it has some really, really catchy riffs in there, some really good grooves in there, some great solos. I like the lyrics, and I really like James's performance. Once again, I have to say probably James has the best performance on this entire album. The Day That Never Comes was the first official piece of music that everybody got to hear off of this album. At least for me, I remember they put the video out once again on YouTube, and I remember watching it and definitely enjoying it. I mean, you could instantly feel Metallica going back to the 80s, and with the Black Album, of course, because this is kind of a traditional Metallica ballad, very similar to Fade to Black, Sanitarium, One, Unforgiven, that kind of stuff. So did a pretty good job. When I first listened to it, I liked it very much, obviously, because the only thing that I had to compare it with really was Saint Anger as far as the modern Metallica goes. And then, you know, later on I kind of had a little love-hate thing with it because, yeah, I felt like Metallica were definitely rehashing what they did in the past, and it was so obvious. And I compared it to like One, which is one of their best songs ever. And when I put it in that light, I really didn't like it. But, you know, Metallica were kind of asking for that sort of comparison. But going back and listening to it a little bit later, you know, kind of listening to it for what it is, I actually grew pretty fond of it. And now I do actually enjoy the song. It's one of the more dynamic songs on the album, very melodic. Once again, James has an excellent performance, and it has some of the better guitar solos on the entire album on it. For a long time, All Nightmare Long was my favorite song on the album because it was so unusual. There's collaboration from Rob on this song using kind of flamingo guitar, which is really, really interesting and really impressive. If you can go back and watch them making the song while they were making the album, that was really cool. Plus, I also really liked it because once it gets kind of into the main part after the intro, it sounded, man, like real thrash metal from the 80s. Very, very old school sound. On top of that, it has a really great chorus, and I actually do like the title of the song, which, you know, can be pretty cheesy, I guess. But overall, it's another great song on the album. Very different than every other song on the album, so it's good stuff.